Vampire King watched from his wheelchair as dancers avoided his section of the ballroom like a disease ward. What they didn't know, the black woman walking toward him, Zara, had just lost a bet with her sister and needed one dance to win it back. Her hand touched his. The entire court gasped, because the last person who'd touched their king without permission had been executed at dawn. The silence that crashed over the ballroom felt heavier than any sound Zara had ever heard. Her fingertips rested against cold skin, pale as moonlight, and every eye in the grand hall locked onto that single point of contact. She felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure against her shoulders, crushing down on her chest until breathing became a conscious effort. The musicians held their bows suspended in midair, frozen between notes of a waltz that would never finish. Couples who had been spinning across the marble floor stood motionless, their elaborate gowns still swaying slightly from momentum already lost. Zara's mind raced through possibilities, trying to understand why touching someone's hand to ask for a dance had caused this reaction. Was it because she was black in a sea of pale faces? Was it because she was clearly human among beings whose eyes held centuries? She tried to pull her hand back, murmuring an apology that died in her throat when his fingers closed around hers. The Vampire King's grip was gentle but absolute, and she felt something shift in the air around them, something that tasted of old magic and older promises. His eyes met hers for the first time, truly met them, and she saw something flicker in those dark depths that looked like surprise, like recognition, like a man waking from a dream he'd forgotten he was having. Matthias Devereaux had not felt his own fingers move with intention for 3 months, not since the silver blade had punched through his spine in the crystal garden where he'd thought himself safe. The memory flashed through his consciousness with the clarity of recent trauma. Victor's face twisted with ambition and calculated betrayal, the hired assassin's hands steady as they drove the cursed metal between vertebrae. The cold realization as his legs stopped responding that this was not a wound that would heal. The blade had been forged in betrayed love, quenched in the tears of someone Victor had used and discarded, and the curse woven into its metal was specific and cruel. Paralysis eternal unless the one who commissioned the blade died or chose mercy, and Victor would do neither. Matthias had spent 93 days in this chair, watching his court circle him like sharks scenting blood in water, feeling his power erode with each passing sunset as they realized their king could no longer stand. But now his fingers moved, now they closed around the stranger's hand, and the shock of voluntary motion after months of imprisonment in his own body nearly made him gasp. Zara heard her own voice saying something about protocol, about her sister, about a bet that suddenly felt less like a playful wager and more like a carefully laid trap. "I'm sorry if I've broken protocol. My sister said there was a bet." The Vampire King's voice, when he finally spoke, had the quality of silk dragged over gravel. Smooth and rough at once, beautiful and terrible. "Your sister lied to you." The words hit Zara like cold water. What? There is no bet. But there is now a debt. Before Zara could process this, before she could ask what he meant, a woman stepped forward from the crowd of frozen courtiers. She was tall and elegant, her dark hair swept up in an intricate style that had been fashionable 2 centuries ago, her gown the deep crimson of arterial blood. Lady Isadora's voice carried across the silent ballroom with the weight of law and tradition. "Uninvited touch of the sovereign is death or binding." The words settled over Zara like a shroud, and she finally understood why everyone had gasped, why the musicians had stopped playing, why her simple gesture of reaching out had caused time itself to seem to pause. She had broken some fundamental rule, crossed some line she hadn't known existed, and now there would be consequences. She searched the crowd desperately for Simone, for her sister who had insisted she attend this gala, who had laughed and said it would be fun to make a bet, who had pointed out the Vampire King sitting alone in his wheelchair and suggested Zara ask him to dance. When she found Simone's face among the sea of pale aristocratic features, what she saw there made her stomach drop. No concern, no horror, no sisterly worry, just satisfaction, cold and calculated. The look of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. Matthias felt the tremor in Zara's hand, felt her beginning to understand the trap she'd walked into, and made his choice. I invoke binding. The court's collective intake of breath was sharp enough to hear. Zara Laurent is now my blood ward, bound to my protection for one lunar cycle of 28 days. If she survives that time, she goes free. If she dies, her soul answers to me eternally. Matthias wheels himself toward the exit, his hands moving smoothly over the custom-built chair that had become both prison and throne, and Zara stumbled alongside him because she had no choice. Her wrist burned with sudden cold fire, and when she looked down, she saw a silver sigil blooming across her skin like frost spreading across glass, intricate and beautiful and terrifying. The mark pulsed with each beat of her heart, connecting her to this stranger who had just claimed her life for the next month, and she didn't know whether to feel grateful he'd chosen binding over execution, or terrified that she'd just been leashed to a vampire king for reasons she didn't understand. The ballroom fell behind them, the whispers starting to rise like a tide as soon as they passed through the great doors, and Zara caught one last glimpse of Simone's face, still wearing that expression of cool satisfaction, before the doors closed and she was led deeper into a world she'd only studied in books and never thought she'd have to navigate for her life. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The private wing of Matthias Devereaux's estate was a study in contradictions that Zara's racing mind catalogued automatically, the way she catalogued everything when she was afraid. Gothic arches soared overhead, carved from stone that predated modern architecture by centuries, but the floor was smooth and level, no steps to impede the wheelchair that glided along it. Ancient tapestries depicting battles between humans and vampires hung along the walls, their threads still bright with color despite obvious age. But beside them, she spotted discreet call buttons at wheelchair height, modern technology disguised among medieval decor. An elevator waited behind carved wooden panels that looked like they should open onto a servant's staircase, and Zara realized that someone had retrofitted this entire wing for accessibility, turning a palace designed for supernatural grace and speed into something navigable for a king who could no longer walk. Her panic was rising, threatening to overflow the careful dam of control she'd built around it. She was a graduate student in comparative mythology, for God's sake. She studied vampire lore, werewolf hierarchies, fey court structures from the safety of library carols and academic journals. She'd attended this gala as Simone's +1 because her sister had insisted, had begged, had made it sound like a favor and a lark all at once. Zara had worn the dress Simone picked out, had followed Simone's instructions about not making eye contact with anyone too important, had believed her sister when Simone suggested the bet. Find someone to dance with before midnight, and I'll give you grandmother's pearl earrings. Refuse, and you have to write my thesis introduction. It had seemed harmless, even fun, until Simone had pointed out the vampire king sitting alone while the party swirled around him like he was an island of pestilence no one dared approach. Zara knew enough vampire lore to know she was in genuine danger now, knew the stories of bloodwards who died in elaborate court politics or been sacrificed in magical rituals, but she didn't know enough to navigate the actual reality of court intrigue unfolding around her. Matthias watched her catalog the room, watched her eyes move from exit to potential weapon to the positions of the guards stationed at discrete intervals, and felt the first spark of genuine interest he'd experienced in months. She wasn't cataloging like a victim looking for mercy. She was cataloging like a survivor looking for options, and that was a different thing entirely. Most humans who found themselves bound to vampires either collapsed into hysterics or became so paralyzed by fear they stopped thinking altogether. This one was thinking, planning, trying to find angles in a situation that seemed to have none. His Chamberlain Greaves entered the room with the silent efficiency of someone who'd been performing duties for centuries and had long since perfected the art of being present without being intrusive. Greaves was ancient even by vampire standards, turned during the Crusades when the world was younger and magic ran thicker through the earth. His voice, when he spoke to explain the rules of the Bloodward bond, had the patient quality of a professor addressing a student who'd stumbled into the wrong classroom. She must stay within 100 feet of His Majesty at all times, or the bond will cause her considerable pain and eventually death. Any harm to her is considered harm to him and will be prosecuted as blood treason. She cannot leave the estate grounds. After 28 days, the bond dissolves unless both parties agree to renew it. Zara's mind seized on the implications, turning them over like puzzle pieces. Why would you choose binding over execution? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Matthias regarded her for a long moment before answering, and she had the sense he was deciding how much truth to give her. Because I'm curious what your sister wanted dead badly enough to send you to me. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through Zara's understanding of the evening. Simone had wanted her dead? No. That couldn't be right. They were sisters. They'd grown up together after their parents died in the car accident, had only had each other through the grief and the lawyers and the reading of grandmother's will. Except grandmother's will had left the family estate to Zara, not Simone. The old Victorian house on the hill with its 3 acres of woods and the herb garden their grandmother had tended for 60 years. Simone had been bitter about that, had said it wasn't fair that the younger sister got the inheritance just because she'd been grandmother's favorite. Simone had married Lord Philip Crane 6 months later, a vampire noble whose name opened doors in supernatural society, but whose actual influence was minor at best. Simone had been angling for power ever since, attending court functions, making connections, insinuating herself into the social fabric of vampire politics in a way that had always made Zara vaguely uncomfortable. Greaves was still explaining logistics, his voice a calm recitation of rules and restrictions, when he mentioned almost casually that Victor Devereaux had married into the Crane family line 3 years ago. Zara's breath caught. Victor, the nephew who had paralyzed Matthias, was connected to the Cranes, which meant connected to Philip, which meant connected to Simone. This wasn't about a bet. This was about an alliance, about power, about removing obstacles. If Zara died touching the Vampire King, executed for breaking protocol, it would accomplish several things at once. Simone would inherit the estate with its 3 acres sitting on what Zara suddenly remembered was a documented ley line, a source of natural magic. Simone would be free of the sister who'd always been in the way, who grandmother had favored, who held the things Simone wanted most. And perhaps most importantly, Matthias would look cruel and capricious, executing a human for an innocent mistake, and that would erode confidence in a king already weakened by paralysis. The room smelled of old leather and something gentler, lavender sachets tucked among the books and furniture, and Zara realized someone had tried to make this space comfortable despite its function as a prison. She noticed the wheelchair again, really looked at it this time. Custom-built with reinforced steel, high-quality craftsmanship, but the armrests were worn smooth from use, the leather of the seat creased and molded to a specific shape. He'd been trapped much longer than 3 months. This chair had the patina of years, maybe decades of use. Matthias's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Can you dance, Zara?" She nodded automatically, trained in ballroom dancing by her grandmother, who'd believed young ladies should know such things. "Good. Tomorrow night, you'll dance with me in front of the entire court. If we survive the week, I'll tell you what I know about your sister's real plan." Day 1 began at 6:47 in the morning, when pale sunlight filtered through curtains. Zara didn't remember closing, and fell across a bed more comfortable than any she'd slept in before. The ward's quarters were a suite that put her graduate student apartment to shame. all antique furniture and soft rugs and artwork that was probably priceless. But when she went to the windows and tried to open them for air, she found them sealed shut, not locked, sealed, as if they'd been built never to open at all. Greaves arrived with breakfast on a silver tray, explaining the daily schedule with the same patient precision he'd used the night before. His Majesty rises at sunset, being old enough to tolerate dawn but finding it uncomfortable. Until then, Zara was confined to her suite and the library. She was not to attempt to leave the estate grounds. She was not to speak to other court members without Matthias present. She was to remember at all times that her life was bound to his, and any attempt to break that bond prematurely would result in her death and his considerable displeasure. The library was 3 floors of books in a dozen languages, organized by some system Zara couldn't immediately decipher, but that seemed to prioritize age over subject. She found the section on blood-ward bonds tucked between treatises on medieval warfare and collected vampire poetry, the books thick with dust, as if no one had consulted them in decades. The bonds were ancient, predating modern vampire law by centuries, original purpose to bind warriors to warlords and ensure absolute loyalty through magical enforcement. A ward who betrayed their sovereign would die instantly, blood boiling in their veins. A sovereign who failed to protect their ward would be stripped of the ability to create any magical bonds ever again. It was a mutual binding, Zara realized, not just a one-way leash. Matthias had tied himself to her protection as surely as he'd tied her to his service. She found the loophole buried in a footnote, mentioned almost casually in a text from 1243. If the ward can prove the sovereign is unfit to rule, the bond breaks and the ward goes free. But the footnote continued with ominous examples. Unfit had been invoked only twice in 800 years, both times by wards whose sovereigns had gone mad with bloodlust, and both times it had triggered civil wars that decimated the vampire population. The burden of proof was deliberately impossible. The ward had to convince the entire Court of 7, unanimously, that their sovereign should be deposed. Matthias wheeled into the library precisely at sunset, moving with the eerie silence vampires could achieve when they chose. Zara had been so absorbed in her research she hadn't heard him approach, and she jumped when his voice came from behind her. "Looking for escape clauses already?" She turned to face him, book still open in her hands, and decided honesty was her best strategy. "Wouldn't you?" His smile was small and sad and knowing. "I did. For 6 decades, after my father bound me to this court." Zara set the book down carefully, giving herself time to process this revelation. "You were bound? Not born to rule?" Matthias rolled closer, his eyes on the books surrounding them rather than on her face. "I was the second son. My older brother was supposed to be king. He died in a duel over a human woman he'd fallen in love with, breaking about 17 laws of the Accords in the process. Our father invoked an ancient bond to force me into the crown, said the bloodline couldn't end with his death. I'd wanted to travel, to study, to be something other than a ruler. Instead, I've been trapped by duty for over a century, and now I'm trapped by curse as well." Zara saw him differently in that moment, not as the monster king who'd bound her life to his, but as a fellow prisoner who understood exactly what it meant to have your choices taken away. She asked about the paralysis, expecting him to deflect or dismiss, but instead he told her the truth with a directness that felt like trust. Victor commissioned a blade forged in betrayed love. The blacksmith who made it had been used and discarded by someone Victor employed, left broken and bitter, and Victor paid her to quench the blade in her tears while it was still hot from the forge. The curse is specific, paralysis eternal unless the one who commissioned the blade dies or grants mercy. Victor will do neither. The only other way to break it is through genuine compassion, and compassion is a currency no one in this court trades. They're all waiting for me to die or abdicate so they can position themselves for the power vacuum. A courier arrived then, interrupting the strange intimacy of shared confessions, bringing a summons sealed with 7 different wax marks. The Court of Seven had called an emergency session to debate whether the Vampire King's binding of a human ward violated the Accords of 1847, the treaty that had ended the last great war between humans and vampires and established the boundaries both species were supposed to respect. Matthias read the summons with an expression that gave nothing away, but Zara saw his knuckles whiten slightly where they gripped the paper. If the council rules against me, you default to execution status. If they rule for me, it sets precedent for vampires to bind humans again, something that could shatter the fragile peace we've maintained for almost 2 centuries. Either way, the session will be dangerous. Zara felt the weight of implications settling over her shoulders. What do you need me to do? We attend together. You speak on your own behalf. If you can prove you're not a helpless victim, if you can show the council that you have agency and choice even within the bond, they might allow it to stand. It's a gamble, but it's the only play we have. Zara considered this, considered the sister who'd betrayed her, and the king who'd saved her life for his own purposes, and the court that wanted both of them gone. She had one condition. Tell me everything about Victor and Simone, and what they're really planning, not just hints and implications, everything. Matthias extended his hand across the space between them, and Zara saw the faintest tremor in his fingers, the effort it took him to move voluntarily after months of paralysis. We have a deal, Zara Laurent, but first, we practice that dance. She took his hand, felt the cold of his skin and the strength still remaining in his grip, and let him pull her toward the center of the library where space opened up between the shelves. Tomorrow night, they would face the Court of Seven. Tonight, they would learn to move together, to present a united front, to convince a room full of immortal predators that a human and a paralyzed vampire king could be partners rather than master and victim. The silver sigil on Zara's wrist pulsed in time with her heartbeat as Matthias began to explain how a man in a wheelchair could lead a dance, and she realized with strange clarity that her life had changed irrevocably the moment she'd reached across that ballroom floor. There was no going back to her graduate studies and her safe academic distance from the supernatural world. There was only forward, into danger and conspiracy, and a bond that tied her fate to a vampire king who'd been trapped even longer than she had. She squeezed his hand once, a gesture of understanding and agreement, and said, "Teach me." The private ballroom was smaller than the grand hall where Zara had first touched Matthias, intimate in a way that made every sound seem amplified, every movement visible from every angle. Mirrors lined one wall, reflecting candlelight in endless repetition, creating the illusion of a space that went on forever. The floor was polished wood, smooth as glass, and Zara could see their reflections duplicated across the mirrored surface as Matthias wheeled himself to the center of the room. How does a man in a wheelchair dance? The question hung between them, practical and impossible at once. Matthias's hands rested on the arms of his chair, and Zara could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself as if bracing for pain. He explained without her having to ask, his voice matter-of-fact in a way that suggested he'd come to terms with limitations even if he hadn't accepted them. Vampire magic can animate my legs for short bursts, force the muscles to respond even though the nerves are severed, but it's agony and it drains me completely. I haven't danced since the cursing. 3 months of sitting still while the court circled and whispered and waited for him to fall. Zara thought of her research, the paper she'd written on adaptive dance and cultural expression, the interviews with dancers who'd found ways to move that honored their bodies as they were, rather than mourning what they'd lost. She'd studied wheelchair dance, partner work that created something new rather than trying to recreate something old. She suggested a seated waltz variation. She would stand, and he would lead from the chair, their movements creating a different but equally valid choreography. Matthias looked skeptical, but he was willing to try. They began with the basic framework. his hand extended to guide her, her hand resting on his shoulder for balance and connection. The first few attempts were awkward, both of them learning the spatial relationship, how close she needed to stand, how much pressure he needed to apply to signal direction. But gradually, they found a rhythm, Zara moving in slow circles around him while he pivoted the chair with practiced ease, their hands never breaking contact. His hand at her waist was cold through the fabric of her dress, but his touch was sure, confident despite the months of isolation. As they practiced, something shifted between them. Zara felt it in the way his stoic mask began to crack, the slight upturn of his mouth when she made a joke about his rusty leading. Rusty like a vintage car, not like actual rust. Though I suppose vintage cars do rust, so maybe that metaphor doesn't work. He laughed, the sound startling them both, brief and genuine, and entirely unexpected. For a moment he looked younger, looked like someone who might have wanted to travel and study instead of rule. And Zara felt an answering warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with recognition, one trapped soul seeing another. The moment shattered when Victor appeared in the doorway, his presence announced by the sudden tension in Matthias's shoulders before Zara even turned to look. Victor was younger looking than Matthias, turned at 28 where Matthias had been 35, and the age difference showed in ways that went beyond appearance. Where Matthias carried himself with the weight of accumulated centuries, Victor had the restless energy of ambition not yet satisfied. He was blonde where Matthias was dark, charm weaponized in every calculated smile and perfectly chosen word. His voice when he spoke held just enough mockery to sting without quite crossing into open disrespect. "Uncle, how quaint. Playing dance instructor to your pet human?" Matthias's response was ice over stone, cold and unyielding. "She's my blood ward, Victor. That makes her untouchable under blood treason law." Victor's smile didn't waver, but his eyes moved over Zara with an assessment that made her skin crawl. "For now. The council meets in 3 days. We'll see how untouchable she remains." Zara watched Victor watch her, saw the calculation behind his expression, the way he was measuring whether she was an obstacle to be removed or a tool to be used. She'd seen that look before on Simone's face, the cold arithmetic of people who valued others only for what they could provide. It made her angry in a way that cut through her fear, sharp and clarifying. Victor turned to leave, pausing at the threshold to deliver his parting shot. "Enjoy your dance lessons." "I'll be sure to send Simone your regards, Miss Laurent." The name hung in the air like poison. Victor had just confirmed he knew Simone, knew her well enough to send regards, and the implication was clear. Whatever conspiracy Matthias had suspected, whatever role Simone played, it was deeper and more coordinated than either of them had wanted to believe. Zara felt Matthias's jaw tighten under her hand, where it still rested on his shoulder, felt the careful control it took him not to react. When Victor's footsteps had faded down the corridor, Matthias spoke quietly, almost to himself. "We need to talk about your sister, and my nephew, and the treaty they're trying to destroy." Matthias's study was a war room disguised as a library, maps of the city spread across a massive oak desk, documents in Old French and Latin stacked in careful piles, a chessboard set up with a game in progress against himself. Zara recognized the position, a famous puzzle from the 18th century that was supposed to be unsolvable, though Matthias seemed to be making progress. He wheeled behind the desk and began laying out the conspiracy with the methodical precision of someone who'd been piecing it together for months, fitting fragments of evidence into a coherent whole. Victor wants the throne, that much has been obvious since he was turned. But he can't kill me outright, because it would trigger blood oath retribution from the loyal houses, the old families who remember what it cost to establish this peace. So he had to be clever. The paralysis curse was step 1, make me look weak, erode confidence in my ability to rule, let the court see a king who can't even stand. Step 2 is using the Accords of 1847 against me. The Accords forbid vampires from binding humans without consent. It's one of the founding principles. Written in the aftermath of the last Great War, when vampires were using human servants as disposable soldiers. If Zara testifies that she was bound against her will, that I used the law of skin contact as an excuse to enslave her, the Court of Seven would have grounds to depose me. Victor takes the throne, and the first thing he'll do is nullify the Accords, claim their outdated restrictions that weaken vampire society. He'll reignite human-vampire conflict, and in the chaos, he'll consolidate power. Zara listened, her mind racing ahead to implications and consequences. Where does Simone fit? Matthias pulled out a folder. Photographs and documents that showed meetings between Simone and Victor going back 3 years. Financial records showing payments from Victor to Lord Philip Crane's accounts. She's his human insider. Her marriage to Philip Crane gave her access to court secrets, information about routines and schedules and security. She fed Victor everything he needed to plan the assassination attempt, told him exactly when I'd be alone in the Crystal Garden, which guards would be on duty, how long he'd have before anyone came looking. Zara felt sick. Why me? Why set me up specifically? Matthias hesitated, then pulled out a legal document, her grandmother's will. Your grandmother left you the family estate because the land sits on a ley line, a natural convergence of magical energy. Most humans don't know how to use it, but vampires can draw power from it, amplify their magic exponentially. If you die without heirs, the estate reverts to Simone under the terms of the will. With vampire magic amplified by the ley line, Victor and Simone could break the Accords permanently, rewrite the fundamental laws that govern human-vampire relations. They'd have enough power to enforce whatever new order they wanted. My sister is trying to start a war so she can inherit a house? Zara's voice came out strangled, disbelieving. Matthias corrected her gently but firmly. She's trying to start a war so she can rule beside a vampire king who'll owe her everything. Power, Zara. It's always about power. Zara processed the betrayal, the scope of it, the years of planning that had gone into positioning her as the perfect sacrifice. Simone had played the role of caring sister while plotting her death, had smiled and laughed and shared meals while feeding information to Victor, had sent her into that ballroom knowing exactly what would happen when she touched the vampire king without permission. Matthias watched her process it, then surprisingly gently poured whiskey from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses. They drank in shared silence, the burn of alcohol a welcome distraction from the burn of betrayal. After a long moment, Matthias spoke with unusual vulnerability. I knew about Victor's ambitions. I've known for decades that he wanted the throne. But I underestimated Simone's role. I failed to see the human half of the blade until it was already in my spine, literally and figuratively. Zara set down her glass with careful precision. She won't let them win. Not for Matthias's sake, not yet. She barely knew him beyond these strange, intense days of forced proximity. But Simone had betrayed their grandmother's legacy, had turned the estate their grandmother had loved into a weapon, and Simone was planning to use vampire magic to hurt innocent humans who had no idea they were caught in supernatural politics. That, Zara wouldn't allow. A servant entered with a message, apologetic for the interruption, but clearly urgent. Matthias read it, and Zara saw his expression go carefully blank in the way that meant he was controlling a strong reaction. The Court of Seven has moved the session up. Tomorrow night, not 3 days from now. Someone wants to force our hand before we're ready. Day 2, late afternoon. 20 hours until the council session. The light coming through Matthias's study windows was the golden color of autumn sunset, beautiful and deceptive in the way it made everything look warm. Matthias laid out the political landscape with brutal honesty. They needed allies on the Court of Seven. Currently, 3 council members were Victor loyalists, bought or coerced or genuinely convinced that Victor would make a better king. 3 were neutral, old vampires who valued stability and precedent and hadn't yet decided which way to lean. 1, Lady Isadora, was tentatively on Matthias's side, but tentative wasn't the same as committed. The gambit was to convince at least 2 of the neutrals that Zara's binding was mutually beneficial, not coerced, that it represented partnership rather than domination. If they could do that, they'd have the votes to survive the session. Lucian the archivist arrived as the sun finished setting, summoned by a message Matthias had sent earlier. He was ancient even by vampire standards, so old his skin had taken on a translucent quality, veins visible like rivers on a map. He was the keeper of the court's historical records, guardian of precedent and tradition, and he valued those things above politics or personal loyalty. Zara had an idea, born from her academic training and her hours in the library. She'd found a case from 1456 where a blood ward and sovereign had become co-rulers after the bond proved mutually transformative. The ward had been a brilliant strategist who'd helped her sovereign navigate a succession crisis, and eventually the court had recognized her not as property but as partner. If she and Matthias could demonstrate that kind of partnership, if they could show Lucien that their bond was creating something new rather than just binding Zara in servitude, it might swing his vote. Lucien listened to her research with the focused attention of a scholar recognizing another scholar, asked pointed questions about her sources and her interpretation of the historical texts. By the time their conversation ended, Zara thought she saw a glimmer of interest in his ancient eyes, a willingness to at least consider the possibility. Court tradition required formal attire for council sessions, and a team of attendants arrived to fit Zara for a gown. The dress they brought was deep emerald velvet that made her brown skin glow, silver embroidery along the neckline and sleeves that matched the silver sigil on her wrist. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked powerful, looked like someone who belonged in this world of supernatural politics and ancient laws. Matthias, watching from his chair, spoke quietly. "You look like someone who could rule this court." The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them was ready to acknowledge. The shift happening between them, from captor and captive to something resembling partners, something that might become more if they survived long enough to explore it. A courier delivered a package to Zara's quarters in the late afternoon, wrapped in expensive paper and tied with a ribbon that matched Simone's favorite color. Inside was a necklace, delicate gold chain with a pendant of green stones, and a note in Simone's handwriting. "Wear this tomorrow and I'll call off Victor. Refuse, and you'll die on that council floor." Zara brought it to Matthias immediately, watched as he examined the necklace with the careful attention of someone who'd survived centuries by being suspicious of gifts. The verdict came quickly. It's laced with iron powder, ground fine and mixed into the metal. Iron is toxic to vampires, not deadly, but severely weakening. If you wear this near me during the session, I'll appear confused, slow, incompetent. It'll undermine everything we're trying to prove. She's still trying to kill me and sabotage you. Zara's rage was cold and clear. Matthias looked at her with something approaching respect. "And you were going to tell me about this?" She had been, without question, without hesitation, and they both knew it. The moment crystallized the shift between them. The trust building despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Matthias made a call to Lady Isadora, his voice decisive. "We need to move the dance demonstration to the council session. If we're going to prove partnership, we do it where everyone can see." The Hall of Seven was a circular chamber that predated the current estate by centuries, built when the Court of Seven was first established, and vampire law was still being written. 7 thrones arranged in a semicircle dominated the space, each throne representing one of the founding houses, each carved from a different material according to ancient tradition. Gallery seating rose in tiers around the central floor, and Zara could see the galleries filling with court witnesses, vampires who'd come to watch the spectacle of their king being called to account. The attendees read like a roster of supernatural power. The Court of Seven sat in their thrones, ancient and implacable. Victor and his faction occupied premium seating in the gallery, close enough to whisper commentary. Simone sat with Lord Philip Crane, her expression carefully neutral, and Zara felt her sister's eyes tracking her as she entered with Matthias. They took their position on the center floor, exposed and vulnerable, the focus of hundreds of immortal gazes. The chief adjudicator rose from the central throne, and Zara understood immediately why she held that position. She was so old her skin had become translucent, showing the architecture of bones beneath, and her eyes held the weight of centuries of judgment. Her voice carried without effort to every corner of the hall. Matthias Devereaux, Vampire King, stands accused of violating the Accords of 1847 through unlawful binding of a human citizen. Victor's opening statement was a masterpiece of rhetoric, smooth and eloquent and poisonous. He painted Matthias as a tyrant clinging to power through increasingly illegal means, desperate enough to bind an innocent human rather than face his own obsolescence. He spoke of the importance of the Accords, the blood that had been shed to establish peace between humans and vampires, the sacred duty to protect human autonomy. He made it sound noble, made himself sound like a defender of justice rather than an ambitious nephew orchestrating a coup. The evidence came next. Testimony from witnesses who claimed Zara had screamed when touched, that Matthias had threatened her, that the binding had been violent and terrifying. The lies were delivered with such conviction that Zara almost doubted her own memory, almost wondered if she'd misremembered the moment her hand had touched cold skin and the ballroom had gone silent. The adjudicator turned her ancient gaze on Zara. "Do you wish to testify, Miss Laurent?" Zara stood, her legs steadier than she'd expected, her voice carrying across the hall the way she'd learned to project in graduate seminars when she needed to defend her research. "I touched the Vampire King because I was tricked by someone I trusted. But what happened after, the binding, that was his choice to spare my life, not end it." She let that sink in. Let the court remember the law of skin contact, the ancient rule that uninvited touch meant death or binding with no middle ground. Every vampire in this room knows the law of skin contact. Execution or binding, he chose mercy. She paused, met Victor's eyes across the hall, then found Simone in the gallery. "If you want to punish someone for violating the Accords, start with the vampires who manipulated a human into a death trap." The murmurs started immediately, spreading through the gallery like fire through dry grass. Two of the neutral council members leaned forward with visible interest, reconsidering the narrative they'd been presented. Victor's countermove was immediate, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "The girl speaks from fear. She's been his prisoner for 2 days. This is coercion, not testimony." Matthias had been silent until now, letting Zara speak for herself. But at Victor's accusation he wheeled forward to the exact center of the floor. "Then let us demonstrate the nature of our bond." He extended his hand to Zara, and she saw the challenge in his eyes, the trust required for what he was proposing. The entire hall held its breath as Zara crossed the distance between them and took his hand. "Dance with me." The Hall of Seven held its breath as Matthias gestured to the court musician, an elderly vampire who'd been playing for royal functions since before the Accords were written. A Viennese waltz, traditional, formal, the kind of piece that required precision and partnership and left no room for pretense. The musician's bow touched strings, and the opening notes filled the circular chamber with sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, reflected and amplified by the acoustic design that predated modern architecture by centuries. Zara moved first, stepping into position beside Matthias's chair, her hand finding his shoulder while his hand rose to guide her waist. They began the seated waltz variation they'd practiced in the private ballroom, but here in front of the entire court, the stakes transformed the movement into something more than dance. She moved around him in slow, deliberate circles, her steps sharp and sure, while he guided with subtle shifts of his chair and upper body, their hands never breaking contact. The emerald velvet of her gown caught the candlelight with each turn, the silver embroidery flashing in rhythm with her steps. The mirrors along the hall, Zara realized, had been placed deliberately, creating endless reflections of their movement, two figures creating one coherent dance, not master and servant, not captor and captive, but partners moving in synchronization, born from trust and practice, and something deeper that neither of them had named yet. She could feel the court watching, could sense the recalculation happening in hundreds of immortal minds as they witnessed something they hadn't expected. A vampire king in a wheelchair, and a human woman creating beauty from limitation instead of being destroyed by it. Midway through the dance, Zara felt heat bloom across her wrist where the ward sigil marked her skin. Not pain, not the burning cold she'd felt when the bond first formed, but warmth that spread up her arm like sunlight breaking through clouds. The sigil began to glow, silver light visible even through the sleeve of her gown, pulsing in time with the music, and with something else, something that felt like both their heartbeats synchronized. Matthias felt it too. She could see the shock in his eyes, the way his breath caught. The curse was responding, the paralysis curse forged in betrayal and loneliness, responding to something genuine between them, something the curse hadn't been designed to withstand. For 3 seconds, just 3, Matthias stood. The curse cracked with an audible sound, like ice breaking on a frozen lake, and his legs, paralyzed for 3 months, supported his weight as he rose from the chair. He took 2 steps with Zara, actually walked with her in a movement so fluid it looked choreographed, before the curse reasserted itself and he collapsed back into the chair, gasping from pain and effort and the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. The court's reaction was shocked silence, several hundred vampires collectively holding their breath, and then Lady Isadora began to applaud. The sound started slow, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether this was appropriate, but it built into genuine appreciation. One by one, the neutral council members joined, their ancient hands creating a sound that filled the hall and echoed off stone walls. Lucian the archivist rose from his seat in the gallery, his translucent skin catching the light, his voice carrying with the authority of someone who'd spent centuries studying history and precedent. A blood-ward bond, when rooted in mutual respect rather than coercion, can manifest healing properties. I've not seen such a bond in 300 years, but the historical records are clear. What we just witnessed is not a violation of the Accords. It's a validation of their deepest principle, that consent and partnership between humans and vampires creates something stronger than domination ever could. Victor's panic was visible even from across the hall, his careful composure cracking as he realized the narrative slipping away from him. He objected loudly, his voice cutting through the applause. "This is theater, staged to manipulate the council. They've rehearsed this performance to make you forget that he bound a human without consent, that he's clinging to power through increasingly desperate means." The chief adjudicator raised one translucent hand, and the hall fell silent immediately, even Victor's protests dying mid-sentence. She regarded Matthias and Zara with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that had seen the Accords written in the blood of the last great war, and her voice when she spoke held the weight of law and history. The bond will remain in place for the agreed 28 days. At the end of that period, both parties will testify again before this court. If mutual consent is confirmed, if Miss Laurent can state freely and without coercion that she chooses to remain bound, the bond will be grandfathered under the Accords as a lawful partnership bond, not a violation. This is my ruling. Victor's fury was a palpable thing, rage barely contained beneath the surface of aristocratic breeding, and he stormed from the hall with enough force that his coat billowed behind him like wings. Simone followed, and Zara caught a glimpse of her sister's face, saw fear there now instead of calculated satisfaction, saw Simone beginning to realize that her careful plan had gone catastrophically wrong. As Matthias and Zara exited the Hall of Seven, moving through corridors that suddenly felt safer than they had hours before, Greaves appeared beside them with the silent efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for the right moment to deliver bad news. He bent close to Matthias's ear, but Zara heard the whispered warning anyway. Victor just sent a runner to the old quarter. He's calling in blood debts from the Crimson Hand. They returned to Matthias's wing in silence, Zara's legs carrying her on autopilot while her mind processed the implications of what had just happened in the Hall of Seven. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the council session was crashing now, leaving her shaking, her hands trembling as she tried to unfasten the complicated closures of the emerald gown. Matthias watched her struggle for a moment before wheeling closer, his hands steady where hers were not, helping with the tiny hooks and clasps that ran down her spine. His fingers were cold against her skin, but gentle, and she found herself leaning into the touch without meaning to. "You saved me in there." His voice was quiet, almost wondering. Not just politically. "When you danced, when you didn't flinch, when you kept moving even after I stood," the curse responded. "I felt my legs for the first time in months. Actually felt them. Not just the vampire magic forcing dead tissue to move, but genuine sensation, warmth and pressure, and the floor beneath my feet." "What does that mean?" Zara turned to face him, the gown hanging loose around her shoulders, and saw vulnerability in his expression that she'd never seen before. Centuries of careful control stripped away by 3 seconds of impossible movement. Matthias's theory came slowly, pieced together from fragments of knowledge about curse breaking and the magic that bound vampires to their nature. The curse was forged in betrayal and isolation, Victor using the tears of someone he'd used and discarded, weaponizing heartbreak and loneliness into a blade that would cut deeper than steel. Genuine connection is its antidote, not friendship exactly, but something more. Partnership rooted in choice and trust and mutual respect. But it's not enough to break the curse entirely. Not yet. 3 seconds isn't 3 steps toward permanent healing, it's just proof that healing is possible. The shift in their dynamic happened in the silence that followed. In the way Matthias looked at her and saw not a ward bound to his protection, but a person who'd chosen to stand beside him when she could have run, when she could have testified against him and bought her freedom with his throne. He offered to release her from the bond early, his voice careful and formal in the way that meant he was trying not to influence her decision. "You've done enough. The council ruled in our favor, at least temporarily. I can protect you another way, assign guards, make sure Victor can't touch you without facing consequences. You don't have to stay bound to me for the full 28 days. Zara's refusal was immediate and absolute. "If Victor's calling assassins, you need someone watching your back. I'm staying." The words hung between them, weighted with implications that went beyond strategy or survival. Matthias realized in that moment that she wasn't his ward anymore. Not really, not in any way that mattered. She was his ally, his partner, and the power dynamic that had defined their relationship from the moment her hand touched his in the ballroom had flipped entirely. He wasn't protecting her. They were protecting each other. The romantic undercurrent that had been building since the dance lesson, since the shared whiskey in his study, since the moment he'd laughed at her terrible metaphor, suddenly became impossible to ignore. Matthias reached for her wrist to check the ward sigil, to make sure the glow had faded to its normal silver, and their hands touched. Neither pulled away. The air between them thickened with possibility, with the awareness of how close they were standing, how her gown hung loose and his hands were still resting against her skin. Zara leaned forward, drawn by something deeper than attraction, something that felt like recognition, like finding someone who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control and still choosing to fight. Matthias's hand moved from her wrist to her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, and she could see in his eyes that he was about to kiss her, that they were both about to cross a line that would change everything between them. Glass shattered with a sound like the world breaking, and Zara felt Matthias move with vampire speed, shoving her behind his chair as a crossbow bolt embedded itself in the wood and steel frame, inches from where his head had been seconds before. The Crimson Hand had arrived. 3 assassins in dark clothing and blank masks, moving with the inhuman speed of vampires who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of killing. They came through the broken window in a fluid motion that suggested extensive training, spreading out to attack from multiple angles. And Zara understood with terrible clarity that this was Victor's answer to losing in the Hall of Seven. That if he couldn't depose Matthias legally, he'd simply have him murdered and claim the throne in the chaos that followed. Zara grabbed a fireplace poker from the stand beside the hearth, the iron warming in her hand, and positioned herself where she could see all 3 assassins. Matthias's eyes flashed silver, the predator beneath the civilized king showing itself, and his voice held dark amusement despite the danger. "Stay behind me," she laughed, the sound breathless and terrified and somehow genuine. "You're in a wheelchair." His grin was sharp enough to cut. "And you're human. We're both inconvenient to kill." The first assassin moved like smoke given form, closing the distance between window and wheelchair in a heartbeat. Blade angled for Matthias's throat with precision that spoke of centuries of practice. Matthias caught the assassin's wrist with vampire speed, his upper body strength undiminished by the curse, and twisted hard enough that bones snapped with a wet crack that echoed through the study. The assassin's neck followed, Matthias's hands moving with brutal efficiency born from wars that predated modern nations, and the body crumpled to the floor in a heap of dark cloth and broken angles. But he was vulnerable, trapped in the chair, unable to dodge or reposition quickly enough when the second assassin came from his blind side with inhuman speed that turned movement into blur. Zara didn't think, just acted, grabbing the heavy silver candelabra from the mantel and hurling it with all the force of 4 years playing college softball, the weight familiar in her hands even in crisis. The candelabra caught the second assassin in the temple, staggering them long enough for Matthias to wheel backward, creating distance between himself and the threat. The third assassin was already moving toward Zara, recognizing the tactical advantage of taking the human hostage, forcing Matthias to divide his attention between multiple threats when his mobility was already compromised. Zara yanked the curtain cord with both hands, the heavy velvet falling in a cascade that tangled the assassin's legs for precious seconds, buying time she hoped would be enough. She dove behind the overturned reading chair, the fireplace poker gripped tight in bleeding hands, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat and temples. The second assassin recovered and lunged for Matthias again, but the third had freed himself from the curtain and was bearing down on Zara with inhuman speed, blade raised high and descending toward her chest with killing intent. The weapon descended toward her, and Zara raised the poker in a futile attempt to block, knowing it wouldn't be enough, that vampire strength would shatter through her defense like it was made of paper. The ward sigil on her wrist flared with blinding silver light that filled the entire study, and a shield erupted from her skin, a dome of pure energy that threw the attacker backward with enough force to crack the stone wall behind them and leave a spiderweb of fractures in the ancient masonry. The assassin crumpled, stunned, and Zara stared at her wrist in shock, the sigil still glowing beneath her skin like a star caught in flesh, pulsing with power she hadn't known existed. Greaves burst through the door with 6 palace guards, their weapons drawn, moving with coordinated efficiency that spoke of extensive training for exactly this scenario. The 2 conscious assassins retreated with the fluid grace of their kind, one pausing at the shattered window long enough to hiss a parting message that carried across the room with perfect clarity. "Victor sends his regards. 26 days left, Your Majesty. If the bond doesn't kill you, we will." Then they were gone, vanishing into the night like shadows dispersing at dawn, leaving behind only one dead body and a room full of destruction that would take hours to clean and repair. Zara's hands were bleeding, she realized distantly, torn open from gripping the iron poker so tightly that the metal had cut through skin and left deep wounds across her palms. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving her shaking, her legs suddenly uncertain beneath her weight, as the reality of how close she'd come to death settled into her bones. Matthias wheeled to her immediately, his expression raw with something that looked like fear, an emotion she hadn't seen on his face before despite all the political danger and magical threats they'd faced together. "You could have run," he said, and his voice was rough, almost accusatory, carrying the weight of someone who'd watched her choose danger over safety. "When they came through the window, you could have run for the door, gotten to the guards, saved yourself. Why didn't you run?" Zara's answer came without hesitation, simple truth spoken in a voice that still trembled from combat and terror, but held no uncertainty about the choice she'd made. "Because you didn't let them kill me at the Crimson Hand ball. I'm not letting them kill you now." Matthias looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, walls crumbling that had stood for centuries of isolation and self-protection. Then he was moving, wheeling to the bathroom to gather medical supplies, returning with bandages and antiseptic and gentle hands that belied his earlier violence. He tended her wounds himself, an intimacy more profound than the dancing had been, his cold fingers careful against her torn skin as he cleaned the cuts and wrapped them with practiced precision. The ward sigil pulsed in rhythm with both their heartbeats, synchronized in a way that suggested the magic had deepened during the attack, and Zara wondered if he could feel it too, the connection that went deeper than magic or protection, into something neither of them had words for yet. "They can't stay on defense," Matthias said finally, wrapping the last bandage around her palm with practiced precision that spoke of field medicine learned in ancient wars. "Victor controls the Crimson Hand through blood debts and ancient leverage, promises made generations ago that still bind their loyalty to his cause. We need to find that leverage and break it, turn his own weapon against him before they send more assassins." "How do we fight someone who controls assassins?" Zara flexed her bandaged hands, testing the tightness of the wrapping, feeling the ache beneath the cotton and gauze. Matthias's answer was immediate, his strategic mind already 3 moves ahead in a game that had turned deadly. "We make him fight us on ground where assassins can't reach. We go public." Day 5 arrived with autumn rain against the windows and 23 days remaining in the bond, the countdown a constant pressure in the back of both their minds. Matthias had arranged a televised interview, the first time a vampire king had spoken to human media in decades, and the preparation was consuming both of them with an intensity that left little room for sleep or rest. A media consultant named Diane, a sharp-eyed human woman who'd made her career managing impossible public relations nightmares, coached them on optics with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. "You need to look united, but not coerced. Powerful, but sympathetic. The camera will catch every micro-expression, every hesitation, every moment of doubt or fear. The public needs to see partnership, not domination, cooperation, instead of the exploitation they've been conditioned to expect from vampire-human relationships." Zara had never been on camera before, had never wanted to be, had chosen graduate research specifically because it kept her away from public attention and the scrutiny that came with visibility. Now she was preparing to speak to millions, to defend a relationship she barely understood herself, to convince the world that she was here by choice, when half the time she still couldn't quite believe the surreal reality of her situation. Matthias found her practicing in front of a mirror an hour before the interview, her reflection showing the fear she was trying to hide beneath careful makeup and professional clothing borrowed from palace staff. "You faced down a vampire court," he said from the doorway, his voice holding quiet confidence that steadied something in her chest. "You danced in front of 300 immortals who wanted to see you fail, wanted to watch you break under pressure. You can face a camera." The interview took place in Matthias's private study, the setting designed to feel intimate and honest, books and firelight and 2 people having a conversation rather than a formal interrogation conducted in sterile studio lighting. The interviewer was Rachel Chen, a journalist known for asking difficult questions with unflinching directness, someone who wouldn't accept easy answers or political deflection. She started with Zara, and the first question was the one they'd expected, the challenge they'd prepared for during hours of coaching. Miss Laurent, critics say you're a prisoner, that this bond was formed without your true consent, and you're suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, developing attachment to your captor as a survival mechanism. Are you here by choice? Zara met the camera lens directly, remembering Diane's coaching about maintaining eye contact, about speaking with conviction that couldn't be mistaken for rehearsed lines or coached responses. I'm here because I chose to help someone who needed it. King Matthias was cursed by political enemies who wanted him dead, who saw his paralysis as an opportunity to seize power. I had the ability to help break that curse through the ward bond, to use magic that could save his life. That's not imprisonment. That's partnership between equals who both bring something valuable to the table. The words came easier than she'd expected, simple truth requiring no embellishment or artificial polish. Rachel turned to Matthias, and her expression was skeptical in a way that made clear she wasn't accepting easy answers, that she intended to push until she found something that didn't hold up under scrutiny. Your Majesty, the Accords exist to protect humans from vampires, to prevent the kind of exploitation that led to the wars and nearly destroyed both species. Aren't you undermining them by binding a human to your service? By creating exactly the kind of unequal power dynamic the Accords were written to prevent? Matthias leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent 3 centuries navigating political complexities and understood the nuances better than most. The Accords protect humans from coercion. They don't forbid cooperation between species when both parties choose it freely. They were written to prevent vampires from treating humans as property or prey, from using our superior strength to dominate and exploit. Miss Laurent and I are proving that vampires and humans can work together without one dominating the other. That genuine partnership is possible when both parties choose it freely and maintain their agency throughout. Then Matthias dropped the bombshell they'd prepared, the revelation designed to shift the entire narrative and put Victor on the defensive. 3 months ago, I was the victim of an assassination attempt that left me paralyzed from the waist down. The curse was orchestrated by Victor Castellane, a member of my own council, who is using human collaborators to destabilize the peace between our species. The attack on me was meant to throw vampire leadership into chaos and undermine the Accords themselves, to create the kind of instability that could reignite the conflicts we've spent decades trying to prevent. The interview went viral within hours, spreading across social media and news networks with the velocity of a story that touched every nerve in the fragile peace between species. Human rights groups applauded Zara's visible agency, her clear-eyed defense of her own choices, the way she spoke about partnership instead of victimhood. Vampire traditionalists were split, some outraged at Matthias's public airing of internal politics, others intrigued by the possibility that the old king might be evolving rather than clinging to outdated power structures. Victor issued a public statement within the hour, denying everything, calling Matthias's accusations slander born from desperation and political weakness, the dying gasps of a king who'd lost control of his own court. But the damage was done. The narrative shifted in ways that couldn't be easily reversed. 2 more neutral council members publicly expressed support for Matthias and Zara's bond, their statements carefully worded to suggest that they'd been watching and waiting, and the interview had convinced them of genuine partnership rather than exploitation. That night, Zara received a call on her cell phone, the number unknown, and she answered without thinking, still riding the adrenaline high of successful media combat. Simone's voice came through the speaker like poison, wrapped in familiar sweetness, the tone that had always meant danger in their childhood. You've made a terrible mistake, little sister. Victor may have failed to kill you quickly, but I won't fail to destroy you slowly. The threat was precise and legally airtight, designed by someone who understood both human law and vampire politics. Simone had filed a claim on the Laurent estate, citing Zara's mental incompetence as proven by her Stockholm Syndrome relationship with a vampire king, her inability to make rational decisions about her own welfare. The estate their parents had left, the home Zara had grown up in, the financial security that had funded her education and research, all of it now tied up in human courts that would require Zara's physical presence to contest. The trap was elegant in its cruelty, a masterwork of strategic thinking that showed how thoroughly Simone had planned this betrayal. If Zara returned to human courts to fight the claim, she'd break the bond's 100-foot proximity rule, the ward would shatter, and the Crimson Hand would kill her before she reached the courthouse steps. Zara hung up and stood frozen in the center of her borrowed bedroom, the phone still clutched in her hand, as the full scope of her sister's betrayal crashed over her like a wave. Simone had been planning this for years, she realized, the careful cultivation of Victor's favor, the strategic positioning to claim the estate, the willingness to sacrifice her own sister for power and money and alliance with vampire aristocracy. Their entire relationship, every childhood memory, every moment of supposed sisterly affection, had been a lie built on Simone's calculation that Zara was expendable, that family loyalty meant nothing compared to personal advancement. Matthias rolled into the room as she ended the call, saw her face, and understood immediately that something fundamental had broken inside her. Zara's first real tears fell then, hot and angry and laced with grief for the sister she'd thought she had but never actually existed. "She's my sister. We grew up together in the same house, shared the same parents, the same loss when they died. How could she plan this? How could she look me in the eye all these years and lie about everything?" The question died unfinished because there was no answer that would make the betrayal comprehensible or bearable. Matthias didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to minimize the pain with empty reassurances that time would heal or that Simone might change her mind. He simply stayed present, wheeling close enough that she could reach for him if she wanted. And after a moment he handed her his handkerchief, an old-fashioned gesture so unexpected that it startled a laugh from her through the tears. She took it, pressed the soft linen against her eyes, and tried to breathe through the ache in her chest that felt like drowning in grief and rage simultaneously. "My brother," Matthias said quietly, "the one who died in the succession wars 3 centuries ago, tried to kill me first. Family doesn't guarantee loyalty or love or even basic human decency. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us most deeply, because they know exactly where to strike, which wounds will cut deepest, and leave scars that never fully heal." "How did you survive it?" Zara lowered the handkerchief, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes that held desperate need for an answer that might make sense of senseless cruelty. "The betrayal, the knowledge that someone you loved wanted you dead or destroyed. How did you survive that and stay human, stay capable of feeling anything beyond rage and isolation?" His expression flickered with old pain, memories that still cut after 3 centuries of trying to bury them beneath political strategy and emotional distance. "I didn't. Not really. I became this." He gestured to himself, the wheelchair, the crown, the fortress of control and isolation he'd built around the wounded man beneath. "I stopped trusting anyone beyond surface-level political alliances. Stopped feeling anything that could be used against me. Turned myself into a king instead of a person. Because kings don't break when brothers betray them. Don't bleed when family proves worthless. Until you walked across that ballroom and didn't see a monster or a political opportunity, didn't see the crown or the curse, just saw someone who needed help and decided to offer it anyway without calculation or expectation of reward." Zara realized in that moment that she'd fallen for him. Not the king with his 300-year reign and his political maneuvering and his careful control of every situation, but the man underneath who read philosophy to understand human nature and played chess against himself because he'd forgotten how to trust partners and laughed when she made terrible puns about his furniture being beneath him. The realization should have terrified her, should have felt like another trap closing around her throat, another way to lose control of her own life and choices. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing in her life since her parents died, and Simone started pretending to care while planning to take everything. They leaned toward each other in the firelight, the space between them charged with possibility and fear, and the desperate human need for connection in the face of betrayal and isolation. Matthias's hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch cold but infinitely gentle, and her breath caught as she tilted her face toward his, closing the distance that had felt insurmountable just days ago. The kiss was inevitable, written in every conversation they'd had, every dance step, every moment of choosing each other, when they could have chosen safety and distance instead. Greaves knocked on the door with the urgent rhythm that meant disaster, the particular pattern that indicated council business that couldn't wait even a moment longer. They pulled apart, the moment shattered. And Matthias's expression shifted from vulnerable to controlled in the space of a heartbeat. Lady Isadora had arrived with news that couldn't wait, her ancient face grave as she delivered Victor's latest move with the careful precision of someone who understood the full implications. He's called a blood challenge, invoked the old rite that predates even the Accords, trial by combat to settle disputes that law can't resolve. If Matthias refuses, he forfeits the throne by cowardice according to traditions older than most modern nations. If he accepts, he fights Victor to the death in 3 days' time in front of the full council and whoever else chooses to witness. The impossibility of the situation was immediately apparent to everyone in the room, the cruel genius of Victor's strategy laid bare. Matthias couldn't walk, let alone fight in the kind of brutal physical combat that vampire challenges required, and Victor knew it. Vampire combat was savage and physical in ways that required full mobility, speed, and strength applied through entire body coordination. Victor had chosen his weapon perfectly, a challenge that Matthias couldn't refuse without losing everything, but also couldn't win in his current condition. The paralysis curse ensured his death the moment he stepped into the combat circle, made him vulnerable in ways that no amount of upper body strength or strategic thinking could overcome. Victor's message included a time limit delivered through official council channels with all the proper formalities that made it legally binding. Matthias had 3 days to accept or abdicate, to choose between dying in combat or surrendering the throne to avoid the fight. Zara's ward bond expired in 21 days, the countdown continuing regardless of political maneuvering or personal feelings. Victor was betting that Matthias would choose abdication to save Zara, that love or honor or simple human decency would make him surrender the throne rather than fight a battle he couldn't win and leave her unprotected when the bond expired. Matthias looked at Zara across the room, his expression hardening into something that combined determination and fury and the absolute refusal to let Victor's manipulation succeed. "I won't let him win. Not like this. Not by forcing me to choose between you and everything I've built over 3 centuries." The problem was brutally simple, and Matthias laid it out with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent 3 centuries analyzing tactical disadvantages. Blood challenges are fought on foot, with blades, to first blood or death according to traditions that predate written law. My vampire magic can animate my legs for seconds, not minutes. Barely enough time to stand, let alone fight. Victor knows this, designed the challenge specifically to exploit the one weakness I can't compensate for with strategy or political maneuvering. Zara dove back into the archives with desperate intensity, searching for loopholes in laws written when humans still thought vampires were myths, when combat meant something entirely different than it did in the modern age. She found it buried in a commentary written by a long-dead adjudicator, a single line that changed everything. The challenged party can name the terms of combat, including weapons and arena, because the trial is meant to test worthiness to rule, not merely physical prowess. Matthias chose chess, not literal chess, but a strategic combat arena, where each piece would be a proxy fighter representing a life decision or alliance, where kings would command from thrones and first king checkmated would lose everything. Victor's fury was immediate and explosive when the terms were delivered through official channels, his protest to the Court of Seven so vehement that it required an emergency session to adjudicate. The adjudicator, an ancient vampire named Theron, who predated even the oldest council members, ruled with careful consideration of precedent and law. The blood challenge statute doesn't specify swordplay, only trial by combat testing the sovereign's worthiness to rule. Strategy is as valid a test of leadership as physical strength, perhaps more so in an age where kings must navigate diplomacy as often as warfare. The catch emerged as the rules were formalized, a requirement that elevated the stakes beyond simple proxy combat. Each king must stake something personal on each move, bind their political power and personal holdings to the outcome of individual matches. If you lose a piece, you lose the thing you staked, immediately and irrevocably, enforced by magic older than the Accords. Matthias began staking political alliances carefully cultivated over decades, land holdings that generated wealth and influence, titles that carried weight in both vampire and human circles. Victor matched him stake for stake, but also revealed something that sent ripples of shock through the assembled court. He'd been hoarding blood oaths from lesser vampires for years, building a private army loyal only to him, circumventing the traditional house structure that kept power distributed. The personal wager came as they approached the final pieces on the board, the moment when strategy gave way to raw revelation of character. Each king must stake their most valued connection, the thing that mattered more than power or wealth or political advantage. Matthias staked his crown, the symbol of everything he'd built over 3 centuries, the responsibility he'd carried since his brother's death. Victor staked Simone, and the casual cruelty of it was evident in how he announced it. Like she was a chess piece, rather than a living person who'd allied herself to his cause. The revelation hit Zara like a physical blow, and she could see the same realization dawning in the gallery, where Simone sat among Victor's supporters. Victor doesn't love Simone, never did, never could. She's a tool, useful for accessing human legal systems and the Laurent estate, but ultimately expendable. If he loses, the blood oath binding her to him breaks, and she faces human justice for conspiracy without his protection. Simone's face went pale as she watched Victor stake her life on a chess move, understanding with terrible clarity that he would sacrifice her without hesitation if it meant winning the challenge. The combat was set for 2 days from now, time enough to select proxy fighters and finalize the stakes, time enough for the reality of what they were attempting to fully sink in. Matthias found Zara in the library that evening and told her with quiet intensity what would happen if he lost. If I lose, the bond breaks automatically, and you're free. Victor can't touch you without violating the adjudicator's ruling, can't harm you without facing consequences that even he can't escape. Zara's response was immediate and fierce, her voice carrying absolute conviction. Then we don't lose. Day 10 arrived with autumn sun through the windows and 18 days left in the bond, 1 day before the blood challenge would determine everything. The private garden on the palace roof was Matthias's retreat, a space few people knew existed, with night-blooming jasmine and a view of the city that stretched for miles in every direction. They sat together in silence first, the comfortable quiet of people who'd learned to exist in each other's presence without needing constant conversation to fill the space. Then Matthias spoke, his confession emerging slowly like something he'd kept buried for over a century. I was turned against my will. My father did it to preserve the bloodline when my brother died in the succession wars, used ancient magic to force the transformation because he valued legacy over my choice. I've been trapped in duty for 127 years, playing the role of king because someone had to, and I was the only option left. When Victor's blade paralyzed me 3 months ago, part of me was relieved. Finally, an excuse to stop, to let go of the burden I never wanted in the first place. Then you touched me at the Crimson Handball, and I remembered what it felt like to want to stand, to have a reason to fight beyond duty and obligation. Zara's own confession followed, her voice soft but steady as she spoke truths she'd never told anyone. I've spent my life studying myths and folklore because they felt safer than real relationships, safer than risking the kind of loss I experienced when my parents died. After they were gone, Simone was all I had left. I ignored every red flag, every sign that she valued the estate more than she valued me, because acknowledging the truth meant being completely alone. You're the first person who's ever made me feel seen, not as the Laurent legacy, or Simone's little sister, or a useful research assistant. Just me, exactly as I am. The kiss was slow and inevitable, his hands sliding into her hair while her hands found his shoulders, drawing him closer with gentle insistence. The ward sigil glowed bright enough to illuminate the entire garden, silver light that pulsed in rhythm with both their heartbeats. Matthias's legs twitched, actual movement beyond the occasional spasm, and he felt warmth spreading from where Zara touched him, heat that drove back the cold numbness that had defined his existence for months. Zara pulled back just far enough to meet his eyes, realization dawning with the clarity of academic discovery combined with emotional truth. It's not just compassion that breaks the curse. It's love, genuine connection between people who choose each other freely without coercion or political calculation. Matthias's fear emerged then, the vulnerability that came with hope after decades of careful emotional distance. If the curse breaks because of you, and then you leave when the bond ends in 18 days, when you're free to return to your life without magical chains holding you here. Zara's promise was fierce and immediate, her hands framing his face as she spoke with absolute conviction. I'm not leaving. Win or lose tomorrow, curse broken or not. I'm staying because I choose to stay. Because what we have is real and worth fighting for. They retreated to his chambers as the jasmine released its night fragrance, the door closing behind them with soft finality. The ward sigil glowed steadily through the night, visible even through closed doors, a beacon of magic and emotion intertwined. Morning light came too soon, filtering through heavy curtains to illuminate Zara waking in Matthias's arms. For the first time in months, he was sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed in ways she'd never seen, the constant tension of pain and political calculation temporarily absent. Then Greaves knocked with the particular rhythm that meant the moment they'd been preparing for had arrived. Your Majesty, it's time. The Arena of Seven existed beneath the main court, an amphitheater carved from living stone generations before the Accords formalized vampire-human relations. The circular board was laid out in black and white marble, each square 10 feet across, large enough for combat or debate depending on the match type. The pieces assembled on both sides, 7 proxy fighters representing the Court of Seven's traditional structure. Matthias had chosen his allies with careful strategy. Lady Isadora, whose ancient wisdom and combat skills made her invaluable. Greaves, whose loyalty was absolute, and whose tactical mind rivaled Matthias's own. Lucien the archivist, who could debate legal precedent better than anyone alive. 3 loyal house lords whose support had never wavered. Victor chose his faction with equal care, vampires who valued traditional power structures and resented the changes Matthias had implemented. The rules were explained by adjudicator Theron with the grave formality of someone presiding over a ritual that could reshape political reality. Each move is either a strategic debate or physical challenge depending on what the square demands. Proxies represent their king's decision and judgment. Winner of each match takes the square. Loser is eliminated, and their king loses whatever was staked on that piece. Opening moves began with both kings playing cautiously, Matthias defensive to protect his core pieces, Victor aggressive to force errors and quick victories. The first hour passed in careful maneuvering, each side testing the other's strategy. The first major loss came when Matthias sacrificed one of his house lords to protect a more critical position, lost the match to Victor's champion, and watched as the trade agreement with the human government dissolved, centuries of diplomatic work undone in a single move. Victor grew overconfident as he gained the advantage, his natural arrogance overriding tactical caution. He staked Simone on a risky attack meant to break Matthias's defensive line, sent his proxy against Lady Isadora in a debate over sovereignty and justice. Lady Isadora countered with brilliant precision, arguing that true sovereignty requires valuing those who serve you rather than treating them as expendable resources. Victor lost the square, and Simone's blood oath shattered. Simone gasped from the gallery, clutching her chest as the magical bond to Victor broke like chains dissolving, leaving her suddenly free and terribly vulnerable. The turning point came when Matthias was down to 3 pieces against Victor's 5, the board looking decisively in Victor's favor. Zara watched from the side, not a participant but unable to look away, her mind racing through possibilities. She realized with sudden clarity what the true final stake was, the thing Matthias valued most. Not his crown or his political power, or even his life. Her. Zara stepped onto the board without permission or plan, her voice carrying across the arena as she declared herself Matthias's final piece. The adjudicator considered for a long moment, then ruled with careful attention to law. She's his blood ward, legally part of his household by the bond's magic. The challenge allows household members to serve as proxies if both parties consent. Victor's face twisted with fury, but he had no choice now, had to stake something of equal value or forfeit the match. He staked his claim to the throne itself, everything he'd been fighting for, the ultimate gamble. The final match was Zara against Victor's champion, a brutal vampire fighter named Kale, whose reputation for violence preceded him. But the adjudicator ruled this wouldn't be physical combat, Zara couldn't win that, and the challenge was meant to test worthiness, not merely strength. A test of character, questions that would reveal the truth of who these people were beneath political masks. Kael's question came first, delivered by the adjudicator with ritual formality. What would you sacrifice for power? His answer was immediate and honest in its cruelty. Anything. Everything. Power is the only thing that matters, the only thing that lasts. Zara's question followed, and she felt the weight of it, knew that her answer would determine not just the match, but the future of everything she and Matthias had built. What would you sacrifice for love? Her answer came from the deepest truth she knew, the realization that had been growing since that first night in the archives. Nothing. Love isn't a transaction where you sacrifice things to earn it. It's a choice you make every day, to see someone fully and value them anyway, to build something together that makes both of you stronger. The adjudicator's ruling was swift and definitive, his ancient voice carrying across the arena. Zara wins. Her answer embodies the principle the blood challenge is meant to test. Sovereigns must value their people, must lead through service rather than domination. This is worthiness. Victor's defeat was total and immediate, checkmate. His throne claim lost along with his proxies and blood oaths and political power. He lunged at Matthias with a hidden blade in one last desperate attack, vampire speed closing the distance in a heartbeat. Matthias stood, the movement shocking everyone who'd seen him confined to the wheelchair for months. He caught Victor's wrist mid-strike, his legs steady beneath him for the first time since the curse, and disarmed him with casual strength. The curse was breaking, crumbling under the weight of genuine love freely given, and Matthias stood before his court as a king who'd been proven worthy not through violence, but through the connections he'd chosen to value. The immediate consequence of Victor's defeat was arrest for blood treason, the most serious charge that could be leveled against a vampire of his standing, carrying penalties that included complete dissolution of political power and possible execution, depending on the Court of Seven's judgment. The court stripped him of all titles within hours of the blood challenge's conclusion, his name removed from house records with the thoroughness of someone being erased from history itself. Simone's fate followed with equal swiftness, the breaking of her blood oath to Victor leaving her vulnerable to human legal systems that Victor had previously shielded her from through political influence and magical manipulation. She was turned over to human authorities to face charges for conspiracy and fraud regarding the Laurent estate. the evidence of her scheming now available without Victor's protection, blocking investigation. The prosecutor offered Zara a chance to testify against her sister, and Zara agreed after a long night of consideration. Not for revenge, but for the closure that came from finally speaking truth about betrayal that had shaped years of her life. The courtroom scene was brief but carried the weight of a relationship dissolving under the pressure of choices that couldn't be taken back or forgiven. Simone tried to appeal to their shared past, invoking childhood memories and family bonds as though they could erase the calculated cruelty of her actions. Zara's testimony was factual and sorrowful, spoken with the clarity of someone who'd mourned the loss of a sister long before standing in that courtroom. You were my sister, but you chose power over family, chose Victor's promises over any loyalty to me or our parents' memory. I can't save you from that choice, and I won't try. Simone's sentence was human prison for fraud and conspiracy, the estate claim dismissed with prejudice, and the Laurent property returned to Zara, along with control of the inheritance their parents had left. Matthias's curse weakened day by day in ways that the vampire healers tracked with fascinated precision, their medical knowledge insufficient to fully explain the magic dissolving under the influence of genuine love freely given. He could walk for minutes at first, then hours, his strength returning in increments that suggested the curse would take weeks or maybe months to fully break, but was undeniably receding. The ward bond's expiration date arrived on day 28 with autumn turning toward winter, the deadline they'd been counting toward since that first night in the ballroom when desperation had driven them to accept terms neither fully understood. They stood together in the same ballroom where they'd met, surrounded by the court of 7 and witnesses who'd come to observe the dissolution of a bond that had changed political reality. The adjudicator's final ruling came with ritual formality that emphasized the weight of the moment. Zara Laurent, do you wish to dissolve the blood ward bond that has bound you to King Matthias for these 28 days? Zara's answer was immediate and clear, her voice carrying across the ballroom without hesitation. No. The shock rippled through the assembled witnesses, and even Matthias looked surprised, his expression shifting from prepared resignation to something that looked like hope mixed with confusion. Zara continued before anyone could interrupt, her explanation thought through during sleepless nights of considering what she actually wanted rather than what tradition or expectation demanded. I don't want to be a ward, don't want a relationship built on magical obligation or political necessity, but I want to stay. Can the bond be renegotiated, transformed into something chosen rather than imposed? Lucien the archivist stepped forward with a leather-bound volume that looked older than most nations, presenting an ancient option that had fallen into disuse but remained legally valid. The ward bond can transform into a partnership bond if both parties consent freely and publicly. Equal parties with mutual obligations dissolves only by mutual agreement rather than arbitrary time limit. It requires explicit consent from both individuals without coercion or political pressure. Matthias's question to Zara was soft enough that only she could hear it clearly, his voice carrying vulnerability that he rarely showed even in private. You'd bind yourself to me? Freely, knowing you could walk away and return to your life without magical chains? Zara's answer held all the certainty she'd found through months of choosing him repeatedly in small moments that built into something unshakable. I'd bind myself to you. Forever, if you'll have me, if you want this partnership as much as I do. The ceremony was brief and beautiful in its simplicity, no elaborate ritual, but rather a straightforward exchange of consent witnessed by the court. They renewed the bond as partners, equals choosing each other without the desperation or political calculation that had driven the original ward. The sigil changed as the magic shifted, no longer a mark of ownership but a symbol of choice, the silver light warming to something that looked like intertwined flames rather than chains. The political aftermath was swift as the Court of 7 recognized the precedent and voted to amend the accords with surprising speed. Human-vampire partnerships were now legal, provided both parties consented freely and publicly, provided the relationship was documented and witnessed to prevent coercion. The vote wasn't unanimous, but the majority was decisive enough to make the change permanent. 6 months later, the world had shifted in ways both dramatic and subtle, the kind of changes that took time to fully manifest, but were undeniably reshaping the landscape of human-vampire relations. Matthias walked unaided now, his recovery nearly complete, except for a slight limp on cold days that served as reminder of how close he'd come to permanent disability. The curse was gone in all the ways that mattered, dissolved under the steady influence of love that had proven more powerful than betrayal magic. Zara's new role had evolved beyond anyone's initial expectations. Her position no longer just partner to the king, but ambassador between the vampire court and human government. She used her mythology expertise to bridge cultural gaps, explaining vampire traditions in terms humans could understand, and translating human concerns into frameworks that resonated with immortal perspectives. The Laurent estate had been converted into something her parents would have approved of, a community center where humans and vampires could meet on neutral ground for dialogue and education. The building hosted lectures and cultural exchanges and quiet conversations between species that had spent centuries viewing each other with suspicion. Personal life was both simpler and more complicated than the dramatic months of the blood challenge, the kind of normal relationship challenges that came with building something real. Zara and Matthias were publicly together, their partnership documented and witnessed, scandal to some traditionalists, but inspiration to others who saw possibility in what they'd created. The romantic moment came at a gala celebrating the amended accords, 6 months of legal work culminating in formal recognition of human-vampire partnerships. They danced, both standing this time, Matthias's hand steady on her waist, while they moved through steps that had become familiar through practice. No one avoided them now, no one whispered about impropriety or political manipulation. They were the center of the room by choice rather than scandal. After the gala, they returned to the rooftop garden where they'd first kissed. The same jasmine blooming despite the late season, the same city lights spreading below them in patterns of human and vampire districts, no longer quite so separate. Matthias's reflection was quiet, spoken into the night air with the wonder of someone still adjusting to unexpected happiness. A year ago, I was alone in that ballroom, waiting to die slowly from a curse I couldn't break. You walked across the floor and saved me from more than just the paralysis. Zara's response held equal truth. Her own journey from isolation to connection, as profound as his physical healing. You saved me too. From a life where I never took risks, because I was afraid of betrayal, afraid of caring about anyone enough to be hurt when they chose something else over me. The courier arrived as they stood looking out over the city, a vampire messenger bearing formal correspondence with seals that indicated high-level political communication. The message was from the European Vampire Council, ancient powers who'd been watching the American court's experiments with interest, that ranged from approval to deep concern. The letter was formal and carefully worded, but the underlying message was clear. Traditions exist for reasons that predate modern politics. We request an audience with the Vampire King and his human partner. Attendance is strongly encouraged. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the threat was obvious to anyone familiar with vampire political communication. Strongly encouraged meant mandatory, meant refusal would have consequences that could destabilize everything they'd built. Zara read the letter over Matthias's shoulder, and her assessment was immediate and accurate. That sounds like a threat, like they're unhappy with the amended accords and want to express their displeasure in person. Matthias's confirmation was grim, his political experience reading the subtext that might not be obvious to someone less familiar with Vampire Council dynamics. It is a threat. The European Council doesn't make requests, they issue summons wrapped in polite language. They want to evaluate whether our partnership is genuine or a political manipulation that undermines the traditions they've spent centuries preserving. Zara's question was practical, focused on strategy rather than fear. So we go? We accept their invitation and make our case that partnerships between species strengthen rather than weaken the social order? Matthias's answer was immediate, his hand finding hers with the automatic gesture of someone who'd learned to rely on partnership rather than facing challenges alone. Together. We go together and show them that what we've built here is real and replicable, that love between species is possible without domination or exploitation. They stood at the garden's edge, looking out at the city they'd changed through their choices, hands intertwined with fingers interlaced in the casual intimacy of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. The partnership sigil glowed softly on both their wrists now, matching marks that symbolized equal commitment rather than the original ward's one-sided obligation. The city below showed signs of the changes they'd initiated. Mixed district zones where humans and vampires lived in closer proximity than had been considered safe just a year earlier, community centers modeled on Zara's Laurent estate project spreading to other neighborhoods. Matthias's question was playful, but carried underneath it the acknowledgement that their work was far from finished, that new challenges would keep emerging as they pushed boundaries. Ready for the next dance? Zara smiled, the expression carrying confidence built through months of facing impossible situations and finding ways through them together. Always. The word held promise and commitment, and the understanding that whatever came next, they would face it as partners who'd chosen each other repeatedly through every test and challenge. The European Council's summons represented a new threat. A different kind of challenge than Victor's assassination attempts or Simone's betrayal, but they'd learned how to navigate impossible situations through trust and strategy, and the kind of love that made them stronger together than either could be alone. The night was clear and cold, winter settling over the city with the kind of crisp air that made the stars visible even through urban light pollution. Jasmine bloomed unseasonably in the sheltered microclimate of the rooftop garden, its fragrance mixing with the scent of approaching snow and the underlying hint of magic that always clung to places where significant events had occurred. They would prepare for the European Council's evaluation, would research traditions and precedents, and build their argument for why partnerships between species represented evolution rather than betrayal of vampire culture. But tonight, they simply stood together. Two people who'd found each other across species lines and political impossibilities, who'd built something real from desperation and necessity and choice. The partnership sigil pulsed in rhythm with both their heartbeats, synchronized in ways that went beyond the magic binding them, physical manifestation of emotional connection that had proven stronger than curses or political machinations. Whatever challenges the European Council presented, whatever new threats emerged from traditionalists who feared change, they would face them the way they'd faced everything else since that first desperate dance in the ballroom. Together, as partners who'd learned that love wasn't a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that made impossible things achievable. The city lights spread below them like a map of possibility, human and vampire territories blending in ways that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier, proof that change was possible when people were willing to risk everything for connection. Matthias pulled Zara closer, his arm around her waist in the familiar hold from their dancing, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who'd found home in another person rather than a place. The European Council could wait until morning, could wait until they'd had time to plan and strategize and prepare their defense of what they'd built. Tonight belonged to them. To quiet celebration of survival and love, and the partnership that had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted when desperation had driven them together in that ballroom 6 months and a lifetime ago.